Good evening, everyone. My name is Renee Hoyos. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Clean Water Network, and I'm here on DTV tonight to talk about the Citizens Climate Lobby. I have with me tonight three guests, starting with Mr. James Talbert, who is the Conservative Caucus Director. Welcome.
Thank you.
Don Kraus, who is the Coordinator.
Good, glad to be here, Renee.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And Joanne Logan, UT Professor from the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department at UT Knoxville. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the Citizens Climate Lobby. We're going to talk about climate change, and we're going to talk about some events that are coming up in the community. So I thought we would set the stage first with Joanne Logan. If you could talk to us a little bit about the issues of climate change in general and what we're seeing now, what the science says about climate change.
Sure, yeah, I'd be glad to do that. I'm actually teaching a class this fall on environmental climatology, so I'm trying to get back up to speed again on all my information. I think one of the big misconceptions that I always have to try to explain to my students is the difference between weather and climate, because those two terms get used interchangeably all the time, and folks will use information from weather to prove a point in climate when in fact they're pretty different. Weather is just the day-to-day, things that we see in the atmosphere, the rain, like it rained really hard today, and so it's the near-term kinds of things. And a lot of times, like somebody might show up at the Senate office with a snowball, that's supposed to be somehow, refuting the possibility of climate change. And obviously any specific weather event. Now, some weather events like large hurricanes that move over warmer ocean temperatures, perhaps there's some link you could give to climate trends, but it's a little tenuous, it's a little harder to prove than the long-term climate, which is more like looking at 30 years of data, 50 years of data. And a lot of people don't realize that, in fact, lots of different agencies throughout the world take lots of measurements every day. They take it in by satellite. They also take a lot of land measurements. And despite lots of controversy in the past, there's very good agreement between those two sets of data, between data that's collected by satellites and data that's collected on land. And they're all showing the same thing, that we are increasing. It's not been terribly dreadful yet. It's just like a degree or two, but it's not been equal around the planet. And so we have an Arctic amplification for sure, where places like Alaska and Canada and some of those places are warming up a lot quicker than, maybe the mid-latitudes or the tropics. Mm-hmm. So, and most climate scientists are on board with this. And I kind of like to draw the analogy with the tobacco industry. We knew decades ago that tobacco caused health issues, but we didn't know every little tiny reason why tobacco caused cancer. But the Surgeon General didn't sit around waiting until every last piece of evidence came in before he said, stop smoking, not good for your health. And so the same thing with climate. We don't know everything about the climate. It's hard to identify a steady state of the climate. We talked about this earlier, that water is so obvious. Everybody, you know what clean water is. But what is the steady state of the climate? It's a little harder to define. But just because we don't know it perfectly, and every now and then there'll be some new oscillation or new El Nino thing that we're figuring out, doesn't mean that we don't know enough about it already to know, in fact, that humans are changing the climate. Mm-hmm. So and those are probably the most important points I want folks to come away with.
How do your students respond to this in general?
Most of them, I teach environmental science students, so I'd say 90% of them are very, very concerned about, the climate, and they want to do their part, and they hopefully down the road would like to get involved with lobbying and, ways to get society to move in that direction. They're hopeful. They're amazingly hopeful.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, because I think they see the technology. I think they see the electric cars, and they see the batteries, and they see the changes going on. So I think they're sometimes more hopeful than I expect them to be, which is really good. There's always the percentage of them. In fact, one I'll never forget, that I gave a guest lecture one time in Dr. McKinney's class. I'm a big fan of his. He teaches the class in sustainability. And it was talking about climate change and things we can do and all the wonderful options we've got for renewable energy and this and that. And she came up to me afterwards and she says, "Oh, I just get so excited, that I'm so convinced and I'm going to do something about it." She says, "Until Monday, I go home and I spend the weekend with my family and they change my mind."
Wow.
Yeah, so that was kind of, she was definitely like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure how I deal with that kind of student. And then there's others that, you know, they go through the motions of the class, but you can tell they're never really on board. But the class fortunately goes over a lot of other things besides climate change, so I make sure there's lots of other things that they can get out of the class if in fact they're not quite on board with that part. But yeah, but they're kind of more optimistic than you'd think.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And I think we have here an option for involvement with the Citizens Climate Lobby. And what we have here is very unique. We have the Conservative Caucus Director, and we have a progressive member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. So I'd like for you two to tell us about the work of the organization and how you guys interact and how you are outreaching to the community.
Sure. Jim, why don't you start?
Okay, yeah, so Citizens Climate Lobby, we are a volunteer organization with about 80,000 members spread out across the United States. We organize ourselves by legislative district, and we focus on a single issue, that's climate change. So we bring a group together that doesn't want to let other ancillary issues get in the way of our coordinated involvement. And we organize ourselves by legislative district so we can go speak to our members of Congress. We are very focused on engaging respectfully, but with depth with individual members of Congress by having their constituents speak directly to them.
And what is your involvement?
Sure. Well, I'm also a volunteer. I'm a field development coordinator, and I recently moved from Virginia down to Asheville. But my role is really just trying to help build groups here in Tennessee. We have a number of groups already in Tennessee, and in Nashville, and in Chattanooga, and in northeastern Tennessee. And we're tomorrow having a training here in Knoxville, where we have a small group here, and so we're helping to build this group here as well. And because really, you know, we have a vision of a livable world for Citizens Climate Lobby. That's what we're about, is a livable world. And that's why Jim and I, who are very different sides of the political spectrum, work together, because we both want a livable world. And we have a mission which is really to build a political will for a livable world by empowering people to have breakthroughs so we could actually build that political will. And so we're about teaching people, how do you talk with a member of Congress, and how do you do it respectfully, because we're betting the farm on building relationships on both sides of the aisle. How do you write a letter to the editor and have an editorial board visit? You know, how do you be able to help talk to community leaders and grass tops within a community and really get them on board endorsing the concept that yes, there is climate change and we need to do something about it. And these different steps that we take, these political levers that we all as a group kind of grab onto and try to yank on, that's what we're about, is really empowering people to be part of that. And it's just been, so I mean, I worked at an organization for 20 years in Washington, and my background is being up on the Hill lobbying, but the energy that this organization has just been incredible. You know, in June we do these big national meetings. So this last June, for example, you know, we had 1,000 people that came into Washington. You know, in the morning we gathered on the steps.
We have a picture of all the folks that came to Washington. Can we throw that one up?
We gathered on the steps there, and you know, we were able to meet with 500 congressional offices, and more than a third of them were the members of Congress themselves, to really talk about, you know, how do we have a climate solution? And we do. We have a good, simple, effective climate solutions that people on both sides of the aisle could get behind and support.
And we really try and start with each of those members of Congress from where they are. So, you know, if you listen to the news, you understand that different members of Congress have taken different positions or are at different places in their evaluation of the data and their evaluation of the science behind it. And we walk in and try and have respectful dialogues to bring them the next piece of information that they need to move a step forward, whether that's seeing more political will in their community and hearing from their Chamber of Commerce or other businesses, or seeing more printed material or having more constituents call them, or maybe it's some information on the science itself or information on some of the solutions or on other members of Congress they could talk with that are looking into the issue. We try and figure out where they're at, what dialogues they're having within among their staff, and bring resources to them and act as a resource for them, as well as constituents that are specifically walking and say, we want you to be acting on this and asking them direct questions.
So do you have them formulate the solution, or do you come with a solution that's already fully formed?
We have a solution.
Oh, okay.
And it's called carbon fee and dividend.
Carbon fee
Okay.
and
Look,
dividend.
as Joanne was saying, the problem that we're having is there's too much greenhouse gases. And economists will tell you if you want less of something, you make it more expensive. You know, going back to that cigarette, example, we were at 50% about of the population smoking, and now we're down in the teens. And it's education is part of it, but the bigger part from the studies has been it's more expensive. They keep raising the price on it. So what carbon fee and dividend is about is you put a small price on CO2 emissions, and you do it at the source, at the mine, at the well, at the port of entry. So that's only like less than 1,500 actual entities that actually where you have to put this fee. And so you start it rather low, and then you build it up. Our proposal says to start it at $15 per metric ton equivalent of carbon dioxide, and then build it up $10 per ton per year. So it goes up gradually. And then all of the money, that's the fee part of it. And we call it a fee because the government doesn't get to keep all that money. Okay, it's not a tax. The government doesn't keep it. What happens is all of that gets returned to American households, divided equally and fairly as a dividend, as a monthly check. So you get a check once a month, because that way as your energy costs rise, for the bottom 70% of our country, economically speaking, they come out ahead on what they get each month versus what their increased expenses are. So that's the dividend part of it.
So does the fee increase over time?
Yes.
And is there a cap on it?
When we have enough carbon dioxide not going into the atmosphere. So we keep bringing it on up until we have a full economic shift within our economy. And that's really what it's about. This is an economic solution. It's a market-based solution. It's a revenue neutral solution, which is why Jim can get behind it. And it brings down greenhouse gas emissions much better than regulations and other ways that we've seen that tried to do it.
So have you approached the fossil fuel industries with this idea?
Yeah. So there's a number of fossil fuel companies are actually behind putting a price on carbon. You can go to Climate Leadership Council, and they actually have endorsements for a similar policy from some of the major fossil fuel companies that are out there. Fossil fuel companies understand have understood climate change for many years, and would like to see a program. Well, I'm speaking for them, but I think this is a fair statement. They would like to see a program that they understand and can make logical business plans in. If you look at the history of like a Shell Oil invested heavily in renewables and lost a fair amount of money on it and sold their whole portfolio because it wasn't something that they were in the market at the right time, and it wasn't something they knew how to make a profit in at the time they entered the market. If you lay out a structure for how we're going to shift away from fossil fuels, fossil fuel companies are very good at planning which energy sources they're going to be bringing to the public, and they can make those economic decisions on how they're going to invest the capital that they have and shift it away from hiring derricks to go drill for more oil, and shift some of it towards other parts of their portfolio.
So I understand that fossil fuel industries want regulatory certainty. How does their plan differ from yours? Or do you know?
Yes, they started at a higher number. We started at 15.
So in terms of Climate Leadership Council,
right? This is Climate Leadership Council specifically, of which ExxonMobil and Shell and some others, along with the Nature Conservancy and some environmental groups, are supportive. They started at a higher number than we do, $45 per metric ton versus 15. They want to see climate-specific regulations eliminated and replaced with this. We're agnostic on that. We believe that if we follow this process, there won't be a need for those down the road. So those are the two biggest difference between the two.
Okay. Now I noticed that your proposal also talks about a border adjustment, and border adjustments have been in the news pretty big with the new tax. Tax reform that we'll be having here this year, and I'm curious why you chose the border adjustments as a mechanism.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have a concern about is protecting our industrial base in the United States. So right now when we take actions that require fuel, there's a cost for that fuel, and we make things for ourselves, whether it's a pair of glasses or a shirt. There's costs involved in there that if we increase the cost of fossil fuel, some of those costs will go up. And what we want to make sure is that any policy we put in place doesn't just take those jobs and have somebody incentivized to take those jobs overseas. So our border adjustment is a little bit different than the border adjustments that were being talked over from a tax policy, in that it's specifically looking at adjusting the prices of items at the border that we're importing to account for the amount of CO2 that was emitted while those items were being produced. So you go back into the countries of origin and look at their manufacturing base. If they do not have a climate policy in place to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions that is at least as stringent as ours, then you put a tariff on those goods based on the amount of CO2 that were emitted while those goods were being produced to equilibrate the cost with American manufacturers.
Does that go into the fee?
And then
It's
that
the
goes
same
into the pot.
fee.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
And there's also another impact of that border adjustment, is because if you're in one of these countries that wants to import to this market, right, and you see that a lot of your money is now going into this tariff, you'd rather keep it in your country. So you can put a price on carbon in your country and therefore keep that money there. So it begins to have a domino effect. We start seeing this shift. And what's really, in how fossil fuels are looked at, because right now we don't pay, fossil fuels and the whole industry doesn't pay for a lot of the cost. It doesn't pay for the cost of trying to be able to adopt to climate change. It doesn't pay for the health related costs from the emissions that are in the air. It doesn't pay for what it does within our societies. So once we start seeing this economic shift in enough other countries, then it has a snowball effect.
Okay. I know there's been some criticism about possibly other countries trying to retaliate and lawsuits with the WTO. So what is the mechanism that you guys have to prevent that from happening, if there is one?
Well, within the WTO, doing these kind of environmental adjustments is allowed. Okay. But on the other hand, if the U.S. doesn't have a price on carbon, and Canada, for example, does have a price on carbon now, and they're doing it province by province, but any province that isn't up to speed by, I believe it's 2018, they're going to have to do something. They're doing it nationally. So Canada might turn around and say, well, if you want to sell into Canada, you're going to have to pay our border adjustment. It could it's more than a one-way street, but we, as American citizens, believe that our country really should take leadership on this. And it's something that we can take leadership in, and we can take leadership in a way that really works on both sides of the aisle. And we've been seeing so much more bipartisan work together around climate over this last actually few months, despite what's coming out of the White House. Despite that is really, really encouraging.
Well, that's good. So you've got a big event coming up tomorrow. Why don't you tell us what's going on?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we're here to do a climate advocate training. And so we will be over at University of Tennessee at the agricultural campus tomorrow. It's going from 9 to 12:30. And people are invited to come. We're going to not only learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby and how we operate and what we do, but we're going to learn about how do you lobby and how do you write that letter to the editor and the impact that has. How do you actually give a really succinct, what we call a laser talk? What are the political levers that we have available for us to pull on so we could be making a difference? This is all about each of us being able to have personal breakthroughs. So this is a training to be able to actually go ahead and do that.
Great. Well, I know that we are all in our own little bubbles sometimes, and that certainly became apparent after the election. And I'm just curious from the two of you, how did you reach across the aisle between the two of you and between the two movements? What are the tools that you use for that?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. So I have been interested in climate policy for a while, and I had a career doing environmental cleanups for corporations. So Dow Chemical was a client, Enbridge Oil, Occidental Chemical. And I have viewed climate change as a real issue, and when I wanted to get active in it, I started exploring other environmental groups. And to be honest with you, I had a a problem with the breadth of the number of issues that many of the organizations were picking up. Finding Citizens Climate Lobby that is really laser focused on a solution that I think is a very practical solution and that has a strategy of building respectful relationships with members of Congress and building out those relationships. It really connected with me, so that when I'm in a group with people who have a broad diversity of political backgrounds and opinions on whether a pipeline should go through North Dakota or whether we should have more nuclear power or more wind or solar or exactly what the solution should be, as a group, what we're focusing on is trying to get a price on carbon. And as a group, we really believe that there's a very solid analysis out there that says that if you put a price on carbon, the rest of these solutions flush out. You can go have your arguments on them later, but you move away from having more carbon dioxide emissions. And so a lot of the interactive dialogue then starts to go away, and we start finding those points of commonality, which are the same ones we're trying to bring into Congress and say, we think there's overlap here and we'd like people on both sides of the aisle to put down a couple of issues and not try and solve all of the world's problem with one issue, and instead try and solve that problem.
I was online today looking at climate funding, and all of it seemed to be about reducing consumption. Trying to get people to dial down their lifestyle. And what I find compelling about this is it's really about trying to use the market, because I think as people, and I think you can answer, you can speak to this. It's hard to ask the next generation to,
to live poorer than we did.
Yeah.
To step back. And I think for me that was what attracted me to become a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, is the fact that just this one focus. I mean, it was such a breath of fresh air. I'm involved with so many different climate groups, Climate Reality Project from Vice President Gore, and Climate Voices, and the NOAA Climate Stewards Project, and they all have different focus, but they tend to be very broad, as you said, and sometimes very political. And I mean, I'm a very political person, so I'm okay with that usually. But this focus on lobbying and on this fee and dividend just really spoke to me. That wow, because I've just come to the realization it's great to do all these individual actions and to, not to, eat organic or whatever, but you're just not going to get everybody on board with that. It's not going to make a impact fast enough. I mean, we need to make a fast impact here. That's what all the climate scientists are. I mean, it's already written. I mean, we already have so much carbon up there that we're going to have some climate change. There's no avoiding it, but we are. And it's just this tipping point we're trying to avoid, this really catastrophic kind of a change, which is going to take some major policies. And for me, this just made so much sense. You just start putting a fee on carbon. And just like as you said with the cigarettes, it's the same idea. People just aren't going to use as much when it costs more. And getting the dividend, the students will still be able to go have their cup of Starbucks or whatever. They'll have money for that. They'll have a little money for that.
Yeah, so in Tennessee, we are blessed to have a very, very conservative congressional delegation. And in fact, our current congressman has called people that think about climate change and the environment kooks, radicals, and extremists. So how would you advise people to reach out to their congresspeople when they get this kind of response?
Oh, I'll grab onto that for just a second. So when he says that, he's calling former Secretary of State George Shultz from Ronald Reagan a kook, radical, or what was his other word? Extremist.
Yeah.
And personally, I don't think George Shultz is a kook, radical, or an extremist. I also don't think James Baker, former Secretary of Treasury under Ronald Reagan, is a kook, radical, or an extremist. I also don't think that Bob Inglis, former senator from South Carolina, is former representative. There are a number of voices out there that are well established in the Republican Party that are speaking out on this, and it's a very easy way to deflect the issue when you haven't taken the time to develop a more robust policy position to present back to your constituents.
Great.
And on the other end of that, we've had conversation after conversation with some of these very, very conservative members of Congress, and we have had some changes of heart. And just because, so many times we will get a comment from a member of Congress or from a staffer, and it's like, hey, you're not like the other environmentalists that come and talk to us. You're not screaming at us, because we have one rule as an organization, and that's you show respect, appreciation, and gratitude whenever you talk to a member of Congress or their staff. And that's where we start the conversation from. And it really, really makes a difference. I mean, for example, we had a group out in the Midwest they were supposed to have a meeting with the member of Congress, and they show up in the office, and they learned, the member was busy, he couldn't be there, and they're meeting with staff. So they start the conversation with respect and gratitude. And it's in one of these little tiny tight house offices with these dividers in them. And this particular member had worked on some wetlands issues, and that's what they were thanking the staffer for. And you hear from the other side of the divider this voice go, hey, I worked really hard on that. And the member of Congress walks around the divider, comes and sits down and spends the rest of the time talking with the group, because we started off with respect. And that's our one rule. And we have one philosophy, and that's it's better to be interested than interesting. And for me, by the way, this is one of the things I learned when I first started with CCL that attracted me to this, is I learned some new things as a lobbyist. Because rather than spending the whole time talking about what a wonderful, wonderful thing carbon fee and dividend is, we ask a lot of questions. We talk. We really listen. I mean, think of it this way. If you go on a first date with someone, who would you rather go on a second date with? Someone that asks a lot of questions about you, or someone who only wants to talk about themselves? And so, it really makes a difference. And we've seen these changes in many, many offices where people, these people who are in the leadership of the Freedom Caucus are now starting to shift and think a little differently. And we have, we've helped create something called the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. And this is a House caucus. There are currently 52 members of it. The latest to join was the Republican chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Representative Royce. And in this caucus, to join, if you're a Democrat, you got to find a Republican to come on board with. And if you're a Republican, you got to find a Democrat to come on board with. And so we come 2 by 2. And
Anyone from Tennessee?
Not yet, but that's one of the reasons why we're here
Okay.
working in Tennessee, so we could actually get there. And we will. This is still pretty new, so it's nothing about the members in Tennessee yet. They just haven't been asked enough yet.
I see. So do you guys have legislation that you're proposing, or how are you going to get this plan going?
So we do have a sketch of our policy that we speak to members of Congress on.
And it's up on our website.
Yep.
Okay.
And we also have a bunch of supporting data on it, of economic studies on the impact. In fact, we even have an economic study that can be broken down by legislative district. So every member of Congress, we can walk in and break it down and say, here's how it would affect your constituents. And then we are engaging in dialogue with members of Congress that are interested in building that out so that we can help them when their staff and inform them as they start looking at putting together a bill to introduce.
But we want this to be a bill, this has to be, at this point, a bill that really has a Republican sponsor and a Republican Congress.
Does, yeah.
And we've gotten to the point where, from not having space within the Republican caucus to talk about climate, we've gotten to the point where just a few weeks ago there was a vote on the Defense Department authorization that basically it was an amendment to take out language that says climate change is a national security threat. And there were 46 Republicans who came on board and joined Democrats to be able to defeat that amendment. And that's because of the work of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. So there's now becoming space within the caucus to have this conversation. So, we're getting really optimistic and really excited that we're going to be able to do this, and we believe we might even be able to get this bill introduced this year.
That would be exciting.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Again, Joanne Logan from the UT Knoxville Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science, Jim Talbert, the Conservative Outreach Director, Don Kraus, Field Development Coordinator. Thank you so much, and good night.
Night.
Thank you.